Hello and welcome. You're watching a very special interview. I'm Siddhartha, Talya. I have the privilege today of being joined by Sachin Nandha, the author of Hedgewar, a definitive biography. It's a biography of the first Sarsanchalak of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. It's the largest volunteer organization in the world, and it's left a lasting imprint on Indian society, Indian culture, Indian politics as well. It's been the object of revulsion on many an occasion by certain quarters and also great reverence. But one thing's for sure, this is an organization that can never be ignored. And as the author writes in his book, it's an organization that one is today compelled to engage with because in many ways its own future is tied with the future of Bharat, the future of India. Mr. Nandha, many thanks for first and foremost coming to the Times Now studios here in Noida.
Thank you very much for having me.
And congratulations on a fascinating work. It's a wonderful biography of the first Sarsanchalak of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. But it's taken you 7 years to write this book. Tell us about why it took as long as it did.
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, 7 years because first and foremost, I don't live in India. I was raised in the UK. I live in the UK. And so the first thing was the geographical distance, right? I had to spend a lot of time here in archives. And archives are scattered. You've got obviously Nagpur, which is where the RSS archives were kept for a while. Delhi, the NMML as it used to be called. And then of course Calcutta, the British Library, and actually there's also a few documents in Paris. So just to gather all of those documents, to then have those translated, to then have those checked and verified, it took a very long time. And to be fair with you, this book, you know, could have easily taken 10, 12 years. There is so much information out there that still hasn't been analyzed. So I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of it. So I think there's still a lot more to discover, actually. Okay. But it took so long because of bringing the authentic source material together to then analyze and create the narrative.
Well, let me read an excerpt from what you write in the introduction to your book. You say, indeed, there is something to be said about the fact that Modi and Vajpayee before him were both pracharaks of the RSS before entering politics. At any given time, thousands of pracharaks dedicate their lives to realizing the vision Hedgewar sculpted, that of a vibrant Hindu nation. Not since Jesus Christ has an obscure pauper inspired such devotion or been so calamitously misinterpreted, stop quote. Now, this is quite a thought-provoking remark that you've made. Why is the response to the RSS, and particularly Mr. Hedgewar, being so polarized?
I think it's because he is an enigma, right? There's no doubt about that. To study Hedgewar and his life has been difficult. It's challenging, and it's very much detective work. He didn't write much. He didn't say much. There's not much on records. Yet he was incredibly active. So that makes him an enigma. But I think what's happened, sadly, in India is that historians should have long ago done the work that I've just done. Long ago, this sort of stuff should have been discovered, interpreted, and analyzed. But sadly, what it seems to me that has occurred is that due to his creation, the RSS, and what happened during partition and post-partition, the powers that be in this country, including the largely left Marxist academia, at least from a historical perspective, I can say Marxist comfortably, decided that it's best that we ignore this character. It's best that we don't even look to entertain the inner mechanisms and the inner life of this man. Okay. And so they just chose to ignore him. And I think it's been calamitous because it's meant that when you leave vacuums, anybody can say anything and there is nothing to root your truth on. And so you start living in a post-truth, postmodern reality, which is no good for anyone. And so what I hope that this book does, and I'm thankful to Penguin for bringing it to the public, is that it should anchor us in certain philosophical truths that the man himself held. Then off the back of that, you can then conjecture, no problem. But you've got to have some grounding. So I think that's why he's been so polarized. because people could do what they wanted to do with him because there was nothing to ground you.
He was also a man of his times. In fact, you draw a wonderful contrast between him and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. They were both, incidentally, born in 1889, just a few months apart. Mr. Hedgewar, of course, grew up in a low-income family, came from very humble beginnings. Mr. Nehru was born in privilege, went overseas to get educated. Mr. Hedgewar was orphaned very early in his life. His parents actually fell victim to plague, and he would eventually go on to lose his elder brother as well, who had inspired him in the early stages of his life, in his formative years, but then, of course, they grew apart for a whole host of reasons. Mr. Hedgewar, like Mr. Nehru, was also exposed to a lot of foreign influences in terms of the people they read about, be it Mazzini, among others. They both read about the Enlightenment thinkers, the Renaissance, among a whole host of other things. And yet, their trajectories in terms of the kind of politics they would eventually follow were markedly different. Tell us about the fundamental points of difference in their approaches, because you do talk about the similarities, how Mr. Hedgewar would have agreed with a lot of what Mr. Nehru wrote in The Discovery of India, about both India's civilizational glory as well as civilizational decay. But there were certain very significant points of difference that would emerge. What were they?
Sure, and that's a great question. But the one nuance I will say, and I don't think sometimes we appreciate it in today's dialogue. So when we say that Hedgewar was a man of his times, let's really frame that, right? Only 10% of males could read and write in that time. Only 100 years ago. Indian society, and I say this in the book, Indian society had hit a low, a civilizational low, in terms of socio-economic, social progress, in every which way indicator you look at, Indian society had hit rock bottom. So Hedgewar was born and raised at a time when India was in absolute abject poverty, chaos, political disintegration, and the future looked incredibly uncertain, not just for him, for everyone. So when 10% of males can read and write and only 1% of women could read and write.
And how many of those 10% actually went on to become doctors like Hedgewar?
Absolutely. So that's another point. So I make very clear that Hedgewar also had an incredibly privileged education because he was one of 3% of males who could read and write in English. And by speaking in English, he immediately opened his entire intellectual world to become global from being local. And so, and how did that happen? Let me explain that. Because often these subtleties are missed in popular narratives. So when his parents died, Indian society, being in the abject poverty and destitution that it found itself in, built social institutions to help orphans. And so one of the ways in which orphans were helped was that basically families that survived these waves of plagues, families would adopt. Anyone under 16 would be adopted. Hedgewar was 12. And so he was adopted. Now, sheer luck. So a tragedy followed by luck, right? Dr. Munjay pretty much becomes his father figure. And Dr. Munjay was as elite as you could get in Maharashtra. He was one of the richest men of Nagpur. He was an eye surgeon. He was an ex-British military officer, fought in the Boer Wars, so he knew exactly what the British were about and how the British bureaucracy and the administration, the army worked. You know, and in many sense, Munjay was a product of English-British education. There's no doubt about that. So now suddenly here is a young boy who has a trauma in his life occur at the age of 12. And then by sheer luck, ends up being adopted by Munjay, who then gives him access to elite India, elite education, and suddenly Hedgewar gets exposed to the same kind of Western philosophy that maybe Nehru, not maybe, he did read. Suddenly, from 12 onwards, right the way throughout his life, but certainly from 12 to, say, his formative years of 25, he is prolifically reading Western literature. So he reads Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche, for those of you who know, is not an easy character to read. But if you can get into the mind of Nietzsche, you really are onto something. And Hedgewar not just read Nietzsche, he could critique Nietzsche. He read Greek philosophy. We know this. We know that he was exposed to Mazzini. We know that
also to Marx.
And Marx. We know that he read Marx thoroughly. Now, that doesn't mean he was a Marxist.
No.
That doesn't mean he believed everything Mazzini said. Hedgewar, one thing about Hedgewar is that he was highly critical. And because he was highly critical, he was able to form and formulate his own worldview. And so he was building a fusion of, he's looking at the destitution of his own country and his own society. And he looks at the incredible privilege of the British and the innovation and the glory of the British Empire, which he discovers, by the way, when he gets to Kolkata, because that's the first time he really sees the might and the power of the British. And he begins to realize that actually there is something seriously wrong with the Indian society. His critique is not that of the other. He does, obviously, quite clearly, vocally, critiques the British, obviously. But his biggest critique was inwards. It was the Indian society which had become so decrepit through caste, through social immobility, through lack of education, backwardness of women, which was a real sore point for Hedgewar, which again we don't talk about in popular narratives, but he saw the position of women in Indian society at that time, and it was not good by any measure. And so he felt that these things had to be re-engineered, revolutionized. Only then the country would be able to develop. So actually, I think so that's it. The point you make about what were the key differences between him and Nehru, let me just quickly cover that point, because I think you're right. Nehru, remember, is also a product of his times, in my view. He was not exposed to the ground realities at a young age that Hedgewar was, which is obvious. So what that's done is that's given Nehru an intellectual framework from which to operate. And what he was exposed to was the English society growing up, right? Whereas Hedgewar reaches the same conclusions to the problems, but he sees the ground reality of India, of his society, of Maharashtra, of Nagpur. And then he builds this intellectual framework in the same way. So you see, the source points are very different. That creates different solutions. So for Hedgewar, he was absolutely clear that whatever solution India has post the British has to be authentically Indian. Now, I mean that in the Frommian sense, the Eric Fromm sense, right? Authenticness. The solution has to be authentic because the problem is authentic. The problem cannot be dumped on another force. Therefore, the solution isn't from the outside. So if the problem is within, the solution has to be within. That's a very Frommian sense, and Hedgewar felt that very clearly. Nehru, however, because he didn't have this grounding in grassroots reality, he adopts a Western solution, which is effectively, look, let's let people have their beliefs. He kind of demeans beliefs, right? For Nehru, all beliefs are equally wrong. And he's basically a materialist. He's a socialist, massively influenced by Soviet Russia. We know that from 1927, Nehru was regularly visiting. And so he was adopting this materialist, individualist, industrialist worldview. And he felt that was the solution. And I have a lot of sympathy with Nehru in the sense that he was a product of his time. Many people from his background felt exactly the same as he did. Hedgewar was unique in that he not only saw the problem, said it has to be authentically Indian and indigenous, but he went and gave a product. He actually went and gave us a practical solution that today we are talking about 100 years later.
Which is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. Been propagated over time about Mr. Hedgewar. First and foremost, Pranab Mukherjee had been invited by the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh to be participating in their annual Dussehra celebrations. There's a big hue and cry, especially from Mr. Mukherjee's original party, the Congress party, which said that the RSS is a no-go as far as we're concerned, and you're undermining the legacy of the Congress by participating and accepting their invitation. And Mr. Mukherjee on his own, in fact, went to Hedgewar's ancestral home and signed on the diary saying this man is a great son of India. Not many people know that Mr. Hedgewar was a former congressman himself. He associated himself with the Republican wing of the Congress, which included Mr. Munjay, which included Mr. Bal Gangadhar Tilak. He was also part of many secret societies. He used to raise funds for revolutionary activity in different parts of the country. So he was a true blue freedom fighter. Of course, his priorities began to change over a period of time. But this aspect of his personality and his past is not often dwelt upon by his critics as well. And that's perhaps an injustice to his legacy, is it not?
Absolutely. Look, I think Hedgewar's entire life was dedicated to the struggle. Right the way from the age of 13, 14, when Munji adopts him. You know, he's doing everything from raising money for Tilak's 1 rupee Paisa fund, you know, right the way through to running firearms while studying medicine in the daytime. Then at night time, he's actually, you know, bribing British officers, military officers, collecting guns, and then smuggling those guns across the country.
He would also go to jail for participating in the non-cooperation movement.
Absolutely, he would go to jail, but also something else we should understand, and we should really appreciate this. Had Hedgewar been arrested in the latter part of the early part of the 1920s or between 1918 and 1920, if he was caught by the British at that time, he would have faced the gallows.
Correct.
So let's be very clear that this was a man who risked his life, literally, and he lived on the edge of what the struggle demanded of him. So this thing then that, oh well, was he really a freedom fighter? Did he really fight for independence? I think it's a tragedy. I think it's laughable. And I think it's about time that people just take it seriously, right? And he really was a freedom fighter.
And even when he became the head of the RSS, after he founded the organization, he did give shelter to Rajguru, did he not?
He did.
Let's in fact focus on his perspective on nationalism, the propagation of his views, which is now being misinterpreted in many circles. What did nationalism mean for somebody like Mr. Hedgewar? How inclusive was his nationalism? Would Christians and Muslims, members of the Abrahamic faiths, be part of Hindu society as he saw it? Give us a perspective on that, because that's something that's misconstrued today as well.
Again, a fantastic question. I think, and Siddhartha, if you will, I just want to give some context to that before I answer it. What, as we touched on earlier, what Hedgewar really understood well was that the problem of Indian society lay internally. And the majority of people were Hindu. So he naturally saw that the Hindu society was culpable for a lot of the problems that were then manifesting, whether that's colonialism, backwardness, etc. And so what he realized, and he called it something different, but what you and I would today call social capital, right? This idea that a society, what underpins any civic society, any civic organization, is the strength of bonds between human beings, between individuals. And are there sufficient nodes in society that allows individuals who otherwise would never meet, otherwise would never talk, would never share a meal, but by doing this activity or this node, it brings people of different class, different creed, together, that, and build friendships, build bonds. Those bonds create value economically, they build value politically, socially, religiously, philosophically, they create innovation. So what he realized was that Hindu society had lacked social capital. And so he knew that the solution lay in social capital. Now, we talk about nationalism. Hedgewar was very clear, because he'd read Mazzini, he'd read Marx, he was clear that there is cultural nationalism and there is political nationalism. What is the difference? In one line each. Political nationalism is when you believe that the state is a real thing, not the government, the state is a real thing, and in order for you to change society, you have to capture the state, own the state, and then from a top-down perspective, you change society. That's political nationalism. So, BJP, Congress, any political party, these are political nationalists trying to capture the state democratically, right? Cultural nationalism is where you fundamentally believe that the state is actually secondary, is actually imaginary, and what is real is the society. So there is Rajya and Rashtra.
Correct.
So nationalism from the cultural perspective says that Rashtra is real, Rajya is secondary or artificial. So you have to have a strong, vibrant Rashtra in order for you to then build a Rajya. Political nationalism is the opposite. And so you see, Hedgewar he went on a journey. He was a radical revolutionary who becomes a political nationalist with the Congress, who then discovers that even that's not enough. The problem is much deeper. It's Rashtra. And so then he moves into cultural nationalism. And so Hedgewar and the RSS, his creation, this is a culturally nationalist movement looking to build social capital across India, beyond class, creed, and class. So across religion. And there are two types of social capital, and Hedgewar was clear on both, by the way. So there is what's called bonded social capital, which is where basically particular groups, it could be geographical groups, it could be linguistic groups, or it could be religious groups, effectively say, hey, we don't know each other, why don't we get to know each other, and let's cooperate. Let's make our streets a safer place. Let's empower our girls. You know, that kind of stuff. That's called bonded social capital. But once you have a strong bonded social capital, two things can happen. The good thing is that that group becomes strong. The bad thing is you create an other. Because the moment you say we are one, now there is another. So there is an othering that naturally happens with bonded social capital. He was aware of this. So he also knew that at some point and in some ways, his creation, the RSS, would have to do what's called bridging social capital.
Correct.
And bridging social capital is where you say, okay, we are a group because we have a common language or a common geography or whatever. But we know that you're also part of this Rashtra, but you may speak a different language. You may worship in a different way. You may worship a different god. But you're part of this Rashtra, so we have to bridge a bond with you too, and therefore we build a Rashtra. Then we will take the Rajya, or build a Rajya, whichever way you want to say it. So Hedgewar is clear that only through cultural nationalism will you be able to build the social capital amongst Hindus first, that's called bonded. Then it should and ought to build those bridges with all faiths in this country and bring them into the Rashtra. That's Rashtra Bhav, they'd call it. So this is the idea underneath the RSS. And so the RSS is beyond any religion. So Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, atheists, anyone and everyone can have a place within the RSS as far as Hedgewar is concerned. Now, I don't speak for anyone else. I'm just talking about Hedgewarian thought.
You mentioned in the acknowledgements that you began this endeavor as a skeptic, and you've now come to admire this organization. This is the final question. What changed your perspective about the RSS as you dug a bit more into the life of its founder? And what would you tell a young person in India who's just an adult between the ages of, say, 18 to 13, the formative years of their own political consciousness, about this organization that you can no longer ignore?
Look, these are great questions, right, Siddhartha? So I went from skeptic to admiration for two reasons. One is I think Hedgewar is probably, and I argue it in the book, he was probably the sharpest mind amongst all of his contemporaries. And I think he saw things that nobody else had seen. Far-sighted vision, a very, very far-sighted vision, surpassing any of his contemporaries. That's one. So he was an intellectual giant. Number two is that he was not just an intellectual, he actually could make people work. He could actually organize. And he's planted the seeds, the organizational seeds, that today has created an organization, as I said, that has weaved its way across the Indian social fabric. Right. You cannot, go into any nook or cranny of India without bumping into something to do with the RSS. To me, that is Hedgewar's genius, right? Now, you can like him, you can dislike him, you can agree with him, you can disagree with him. That's a by the by. But what you cannot do, I think, in order to understand modern India, so if you are an Indian living here and you want to understand your own society, you have to start off understanding the RSS. And within the RSS, where better place to start than the founder?
Sure.
Hence the book.
And just on a parting note, I mean, this book does a fantastic job of also talking about the differences that Mr. Hedgewar had with a lot of his contemporaries, not just those necessarily associated with the left, or for that matter, Mr. Gandhi. Some of his most significant differences or points of differences were with the likes of Mr. Savarkar, even Mr. Munjay, his mentor, even Bal Gangadhar Tilak over issues such as the Lucknow Pact, among a whole host of other matters. But if we ended up discussing all of that within the space of half an hour in this program, we'd be giving it all away. So I'd actually leave that for our readers to go through. It's an exhaustive work on the founder of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, Mr. Keshav Baliram Hedgewar, a fascinating personality in more ways than one. And many congratulations once again, Dr. Nandha, for this work, and wish you all the best with the book and, of course, more such works in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much.